Can you imagine being born into a family of slaves and your life is in danger, but miraculously becoming a member of the royal family of Egypt with the possibility of being heir to the throne of Pharaoh? Welcome, my dear listener. Today you will know the greatest secret of the prophet Moses. So get comfortable, open your Bible, and let's learn together many valuable lessons for our lives. Before delving into this topic, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you every time we publish a new video. Let's get started. Moses was an Israeli prophet. He was an absolute reference for the Jewish people, who also considered him a legislator of their regulations. He is one of the most important figures and characters in the Old Testament of the Bible. Her life and work are recounted in the biblical books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses is considered an influential preacher of the Word of God for all Abrahamic religions, guide and liberator of the Hebrew people. He freed him from the slavery to which the Egyptians had subjected him and led him to the promised land after sealing an alliance with God. He was the articulator and disseminator of the Ten Commandments, considered the fundamental laws of Jews and Christians. Now, as we consider all these wonders that God worked through the life of Moses, it is also essential to remember his birth, since it shows us that the enemy of our soul has always been and will be in opposition against the will of God. Moses was born during a terrible time for his people, Israel. They had lived in Egypt for hundreds of years, settling there when his ancestor Joseph was governor of Egypt under another pharaoh. In stark contrast to the privileged lifestyle they had enjoyed during Joseph's time, the Israelites were now slaves and suffering under their Egyptian masters. Even worse, Pharaoh had ordered the slaughter of all Israelite children because he was concerned about the rapid growth of the Hebrew population. Dear listener, in the next video, we will study chapter 1 of Exodus, and we will see the general situation of God's people in Egypt, but the perspective changes in chapter 2, focusing on the history of a particular family. Let's read Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. A man of the family of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi to wife, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And seeing that he was beautiful, he hid him for 3 months. This is the secular story of the man who sees a woman, falls in love. She in turn reciprocates. They get married and have a child, as happens everywhere. Moses was writing the story of his parents and his birth, and he did so briefly without going into further detail. For this reason, we must turn to other parts of the Bible to obtain more details about those events. If we had the opportunity to write our biography, we would possibly include more details about our parents. However, Moses did not even mention the name of his parents. These were ordinary people, living in slavery, members of the tribe of Levi. At this point, it is all that Moses recorded in the story, although he later includes their names, Amram and Jochebed. Let's read Numbers chapter 26, verse 59. Amram's wife was named Jochebed, daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. She bore Amram Aaron and Moses and her sister Miriam. Now the account of the Exodus tells us, and she gave birth to a son, and seeing that he was beautiful, she hid him 3 months. Dear listeners, the word that describes the baby is translated into English as beautiful, but in Hebrew it is tav, which literally means good. Jewish commentators explain that his parents saw something special in their son. That is, they knew that he brought a divine purpose. In his speech, Stephen states that God showed favor to this child whom they will call Moses. Let's read Acts chapter 7, verse 20. At that same time Moses was born, and he was pleasing to God, and he was raised 3 months in his father's house. In the letter to the Hebrews, the author points out that by faith, his parents dared to hide him instead of handing him over. Let's read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden by his parents for 3 months, because they saw him as a beautiful child, and they did not fear the king's decree. Now, why did this couple of Levites have to hide their baby? They already had 2 children, Aaron and Miriam. But they hid the baby because the king of Egypt ordered all the males born to the Israelites to be killed, ordering them to be thrown into the river as soon as they were born, as Exodus chapter verse 22 alludes to. What justification could the king of Egypt have to do something so savage and convince the people to accept it? The explanation may lie in his religion. The Egyptians considered the Nile River to be a god. Therefore, it is likely that the Pharaoh said that this god demanded the death of Hebrew babies. Let's continue reading the biblical story. Let's go to verse 3. But not being able to hide him any longer, he took a reed box and caulked it with asphalt and pitch, and placed the child in it, and placed him in a reed bed on the bank of the river. It is evident that Moses was a healthy child. His parents were able at first to hide him, but there came a day when the child began to cry and scream at the top of his lungs. What a contrast to the scene that would take place years later, when the Lord would ask him to be his spokesman before Pharaoh, and Moses would respond that he did not know how to speak. Jochebed had a serious problem. She couldn't hide the child any longer. It would have been imprudent to keep him in the house, since a guard could easily have heard him crying, which would have meant the death of the child. And since faith is not at odds with common sense, which is also provided by God, Jochebed acted sensibly and placed Moses in a small reed box and caulked it with asphalt and pitch. The word that translates into Spanish as arquilla or basket in Hebrew is tiba. The first time this word is used in the Bible is in reference to Noah's Ark. To reinforce the thematic connection, it is also noted here that the ark was caulked with pitch, just as they did with Noah's Ark, to prevent water from penetrating. The Theba or ark is characterized by having no oars, no rudder, no sail, thus being at the mercy of the currents. In other words, it is at the mercy of God. In that sense, her mother gave her baby into the hands of the Lord. And on the other hand, although the casket was protected from water, there was also the danger of crocodiles, which abound in the waters of the Nile. What happened then with the baby in the chest? In the following verses, we read that having been left adrift, the casket floated to the place that would have been least thought of or desired. Let's continue reading verses 4 to 6. And one of his sisters stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And Pharaoh's daughter went down to wash in the river, and as her maidens were walking along the bank of the river, she saw the casket in the reed bed, and sent one of her maids to take it. And when he opened it, he saw the child, and behold, the child was crying, and having compassion on him, she said, "This is one of the children of the Hebrews." What happened shows us the hand of the Lord, and how he was going to intervene in this situation in which Jochebed demonstrated his faith, common sense, and sensitivity. None other than Pharaoh's daughter went down to the river to bathe in that protected place, and the basket caught her attention. Once the basket is opened, the child began to cry, and the woman could not remain insensitive. His feelings took precedence over the orders his father had issued regarding Hebrew children. Ironically, God took the baby into the hands of the enemy, the last place we would have thought she would be safe. In theory, the Pharaoh's house was the most dangerous place for a Hebrew baby by the king's decree, but God knows what he does, and it was precisely there that he received protection and care. Let's continue reading the biblical story. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse of the Hebrew women, so that she may raise this child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Go." Then the damsel went and called the child's mother, to whom Pharaoh's daughter said, "Take this child and raise it for me, and I will repay you." And the woman took the child and nursed him. And that was also the opportune moment for Moises' sister to appear and offer a useful suggestion to the princess. Using the clever initiative of Moses' family and the need of Pharaoh's daughter, God arranged a way for Moses' mother to educate him in his early years and be paid for it. God rewarded the faith of Moses' mother for trusting him by hiding Moses for 3 months, and because she trusted God by putting Moses in the river. The miracle definitely had the seal of God. But the day came when the child was to be taken to the royal palace, and even that God allowed it because he had a purpose for this Levite man. Let's continue reading verse 10. And when the child was grown, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him, and named him Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." The name Moses, in Hebrew Moshe, means brought out. Pharaoh's daughter gave him this name because he was taken out of the water, but the name also turned out to be prophetic, since God had chosen this man to bring out the Israelites from Egypt. While Pharaoh was planning the extermination of the children of Israel, God was preparing their liberation and redemption. Certainly Moses was raised with the science and learning of Egypt. In Acts chapter 7 verse 22 it says, "And Moses was taught in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in his words and deeds." Egypt had one of the most prominent academic and scientific societies among ancient cultures. It is reasonable to think that Moses was instructed in geography, history, grammar, writing, literature, philosophy, and music. And on the other hand, since he belonged to the royal family, we expect that when Moses went anywhere, he rode in a princely chariot, and his guards shouted, "Bow the knee." If he floated on the Nile, he was on a magnificent boat with musical accompaniment. He lived the life of royalty. Dear listeners, the real turn of those events shows us how God acted in favor of those who placed their faith in him. Well, the child's mother herself was in charge of raising him. Now, although the historical identification of the Pharaoh from the time of oppression has been the subject of controversy and speculation, Pharaoh's daughter may have been the eldest daughter of the famous Ramses II, or perhaps his sister. According to the customs of the time, the princess's first son had the right to access the throne, and then, in the event that Ramses II and his queen had remained childless, Moses would have been the Pharaoh's successor. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus wrote this, and said that Moses was the heir to the throne of Egypt, and that, as a young man, he led the armies of Egypt in a victorious battle against the Ethiopians. Moses spent the first 40 years of his life in Pharaoh's court, where he grew up and was educated as an Egyptian. His appearance, his speech, and his manner of acting were those of an Egyptian. Later in this book of Exodus, we will see that when he arrived in Midian, he was recognized as an Egyptian. Moses was educated in the Great Temple of the Sun, which was the most important university of that time. Sometimes we tend to give little value to the knowledge and achievements of the Egyptians. His knowledge of astronomy was extraordinary and included studies on the distance between the sun and the earth, and theories about the roundness of the earth. They were also noted for their mastery of chemistry, evident in the way they were able to embalm the dead, technique that has not yet been equaled. His skill in preparing colors was extraordinary, since the tones achieved were brighter than ours today, since it has not been possible to discover the formulas to produce the color that the Egyptians used. It is incredible that such colors are still luminous, surprisingly vivid and beautiful after 4,000 years. In addition to all these discoveries, the Egyptians also had a large library. In Acts chapter 7 verse 22 we are told, "And Moses was taught in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in his words and deeds." The only major deficiency in Moses' academic training was that he had not been instructed in how to serve God. But let's not think little of him, because he was an extraordinary man. Stephen, the first martyr of the Christian church, in the book of Acts chapter 7, offered us a penetrating insight into this period of Moses' life. Dear listener, Satan always seeks to destroy us, and somehow he knows the purpose that God has for our lives. Let us move forward despite all the adversities that arise. God is faithful, and he will fulfill his purposes in our lives. Before being called by God, Moses had a process of 40 years as a shepherd of sheep, in contrast to the 40 years he lived as a prince in Egypt. He knew what it means to live with all earthly riches and with all that he chose to serve God, rather than cling to the temporal things of this world, just as the author of Hebrews wrote. By faith, Moses, now grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the temporal pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of the Egyptians, because she had her sights set on the award. And so we come to the end of this video. Strong and brave until the end, dear listeners. That's all from me, and I'll be with you in a future video.